A pleasure to me all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So, as I sit here in the 6 o'clock morning, I will say that the last two episodes for this week will, of course, be focusing on the next two installments of House of the Dead, although I will briefly touch on the 2009 installment. This one, of course, was an arcade, much like with the other three installments, but not much more can be said about it. It still does revitalize the old House of the Dead feel to it, but in a more modernized setting. Anyways, though, with House of the Dead 2, though, things would be a bit different. While the arcade variant would still go on around as far back as late 1998, console variations would start spawning around within the following year, especially with the release and eventual success of the Sega Dreamcast, which would occur throughout March through September of 1999, when the Japanese Dreamcast would be released, and then, following it, the American one. So, with House of the Dead 2 mainly being a 1999 title, as opposed to the 96 title that we got with the first title, the second game basically corresponds with the release of the third Resident Evil game, which of course came out in 1999, so not exactly matching up with the likes of what House of the Dead 1 did with the first Resident Evil title, because after all, they were making Resident Evil titles in rapid succession, mostly because of their success, and also because the usage of tank controls somehow was a lot easier than the usage of more modern controls, which in the programmer's mind were a bit complex. Anyways, though, the plot of this one does situate on AMS Agent G, for the most part, as well as Dr. Kurian. And Kurian, especially with the manner that happened inside of his mansion, especially after that magician guy appeared. Like I said, tyrant versus magician ought to be a death battle sequence at bare minimum, from what I'm seeing here. In any case, though, what happens is that in 2000, a little while after the events of the first game, there are two agents that follow with AMS, just like with G. This time, it consists of James Taylor and Gary Stewart. These two operatives would work with other agents, Harry and Amy, in which that G apparently had lost contact, so they're now set in around the same location to find out where he is and bring him back home. They hope to also evacuate civilian populations in the area just as well, because of what had happened. And while, unfortunately, much like what happened in 98 when the first game takes place, the events of this game does situate a lot more on the zombie apocalypse that's still ongoing by this point. So we definitely have had a lot to work with. And even worse, there's quite a lot more that Kurian himself is launching out at AMS. Eventually, though, what happens is that after a number of rail shooting sequences go over, a lot of zombies killed, a lot of blood and splatters, a lot of points scored, a library becomes the next setting. G is discovered there, and while he unfortunately is injured from his encounters with the undead, there actually is a bit of intel that AMS is able to recover. Thanks to G's efforts, they were able to find a journal that encompasses special information. The enemies themselves, unlike with the first game, do have more unique powers in them. And while there's more efforts to attempt to get closer to Kurian's new master plan, there also happens to be some other blockades in the road here. Other than what happened with G and his injuries and the intel he provided, there unfortunately is a little thing known as Judgment. Pretty much like the tarot card Judgment. And the Impish, which are basically known as fairies or demons, according to medieval times, Zeal is revealed to be its name. And there's essentially a giant puppet that it manages to wield. Zeal Kural. Can't be sure if I pronounced that right. Having not really played the game very much, I can't say I have had much memories of it over the years, But I will have lots to say about the third title. But by the end of the game here, well, we discovered that we actually have more information about Dr. Kyrian and all of his pressing matters over the years, leading up to the apocalypse. It turns out that there is a businessman, Caleb Goldman. He was apparently the guy who was responsible for financing the research. And up until this very point, he hadn't really been known much throughout the House of the Dead timeline. But let's be real here. There's just been a ton of stuff that's been overlooked up until this point. Well, there are some boss battles that take place, much like with the first game, and there's also a lot that happened in the third game as well, which, for tomorrow, we'll talk about House of the Dead 3. Anyways, though, some boss battles that happen other than Quarrel, basically the axe-wielding puppet whom is not with a head for some reason, there's also some serpents which are referred to as the Tower for some odd reason. And eventually, there's other things that happen. A giant zombie who's buff, known as Stray. It makes sense that a lot of these bosses happen to be named after certain tarot cards. I mean, we got Tower, we got Strength, and we got, of course, Zeal. All these different enemies just so happen to be relative to that of some old tarot cards from back in the day. Either way you look at it, though, House of the Dead 2 is already a pretty unique way to create a sequel to an award-winning arcade game. But let's be real here. We do have the likes of the Magician. Yep. Goldman was apparently able to bring him back to life. And as crazy as that might sound, well, there's actually even more waiting for these guys. These AMS agents, from G to Harry, I mean, James and Gary are mostly whom we're playing as in the arcade or otherwise. There apparently is another creature called the Emperor, a crystalline creature of some sorts. Yeah, a guy made of crystal. Who would have thought? Apart from the Magician, the Emperor is also rather formidable. It is, after all, designed to destroy people. And while the Magician is somehow easily taken care of, unlike the first game where he was a pretty formidable foe about magic and stuff, the Emperor was a rather different story. Even though Goldman was easy to catch up to in his own HQ from the AMS agents, the likes of James and Gary were able to get to him easily. They find him, confront him, and well, as a last-ditch effort, Goldman decides to release the Emperor into the world, forcing James and Gary to fight it, and conclusifying this game in one epic bash. And woof. However, though, there is a certain quote that radiates with people for years to come, because it would take about 3 years from Dreamcast players to Xbox 2001 players to eventually have House of the Dead Part 3. And while some people might not like the third game, I will admit, I've had a lot of memories with it over the years. That quote, of course, that radiates with people, known as "In time, a successor will come." Just like with the first game, however, there are multiple endings that come around. For example, there is a solo game that can occur with player 1 or 2, whether you're James or Gary. Of course, if you defeat the last boss, if you have a number of continues and points earned, typically this is the level of criteria that gets followed up on and gives you whatever ending that will come around. It typically is generated based on what goes on. There's a good ending, a bad ending, and unfortunately, there's a bit of complication that goes on. With the good ending, Thomas Rogan, a character whom we had seen before, well, James and Gary actually encounter him on short notice. And while Rogan informs them that the other agents are okay, they should head off to the next battle. And the next battle basically insinuates to what Part 3 showcases. But like I said, tomorrow we'll work on that. Unfortunately, though, with the last ending, this ending, which is a pretty horrible one, the likes of a zombified Goldman goes outside the building and a gunshot is heard over a white screen, possibly concluding to the fact that maybe one of our characters died. Who really knows? With 3 different endings to choose from in this game, House of the Dead Part 2, like the first one, still gives a lot of curiosity to people of all sorts. Gamers and experienced zombie apocalyptic scenario artists, writers, and whatnot will probably appreciate this sequel. I myself am pretty intrigued by what they were able to accomplish here. They go so far as to create a big double twist with a businessman rather than the unique mad scientist from the first game. I will say that it might be conflicting to some people who might not like the idea that there was a bigger man, even more powerful than that of a mad scientist, who brought a zombie with magic in mind, and a crystalline creature is apparently the massive creation that the businessman is responsible for. I mean, Kyrian could have been responsible for both of those creations. Just think, with the scientist who was capable of creating a zombie that could wield magic, he probably could have actually made something like this crystalline entity. But either way you look at it though, it's still a good sequel. And while it's arguable enough that many people might not like this as much as with the first game, I of course am always a fan of sequels. No doubt about it. Doesn't matter how much they suck, they just do a good job at telling a story. Giving us what we're looking for. A part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, part 6. And then of course there was the more recent series of Part X, which as we know is the Roman numeral meaning 10. And while it's a much bigger tradition nowadays, considering how many franchises have made it to number 10, like Fast X, or even the likes of Mission Impossible, it could be leading to number X or 10 by any means. It just all depends on what goes on. Anyways though, even Saw X has been put together. My final scoring though on House of the Dead Part 2, because of what it does as a sequel and as a big arcade and console port just like with the first game, we'll go ahead and give it an 8.3 out of 10.1. So probably as much of a classic as was the first game. However, we do have the third game to cover, and I probably won't go into all that much detail on the 2009 title or even any other titles associated with the franchise. Anyways though, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.